I had this customer that they said to me, why is our cost of, it was Google Cloud Storage, so same as an S3 bucket, so AWS, Google, same here. Why is our cost going up on this bucket every month? And as we started looking into it, we realized the amount of data being stored hadn't changed at all in 2 months, and it was like 2 gigabytes. It was almost nothing. And as we started diving into it, took a little while, going through a few different dashboards, we found out that it was actually the read requests on the buckets. As we started getting closer to an answer, one of the engineers at their side went, oh my God, he had one of those realization moments that never make you feel particularly good. It's a bit like Ian mentioned about pressing enter on the wrong server. He had that realization moment. He said, it's the Vault. I said, what? They were running HashiCorp Vault on one of their cloud buckets, and each month they were adding the number of Kubernetes clusters that were querying that Vault. And the cost was going up because the number of containers that were needing to query the Vault was increasing month on month. So they were actually spending something like $2,000 a month, $3,000 a month by the time we caught it on these requests. And every single container within the clusters was calling every time it needed a password for something. It was calling for a fresh copy of the password. Now that's not necessarily needed, and there are plenty of ways to mitigate that. The simplest one is in the client itself. You can say, don't request a new one so often, or cache it for 15 minutes or half an hour or something, with a couple of rollouts and so there's a slight change in their container configurations, but they brought that back down to a very reasonable number, I think down to $100 a month now or something like that. So something much more reasonable. Yeah. It's a similar situation to what Ian said. It's a bit of a rounding error for that company, but it was a curiosity for them, much like I think was mentioned earlier on the call, where people just see this sort of slowly increasing, like the temperature with the frog, right? If you put them in a cold kettle. So I think they eventually got to a point where they said, this is really a lot. We're not storing anything here. What's going on? So it was a nice win to have, yeah.
That's a good point. And a lot of people don't really understand a frontal lobe kind of level, but they don't understand the impact of it. So things like a common mistake I saw at AWS was they've got some S3 storage stuff, which is a fantastic place to put it. It's very durable and very accessible. And they were doing functions which essentially were listing the contents of the S3 bucket for what that was the nature of their workload. And so they were like, hey, we're listing this data, it's a part of the workload. They didn't realize that there's a cost for each of those for accessing S3. And so their actual access, just doing that rather useless list function, was costing them, as it goes, that was only a few $100s a day, but that was in that one workload. And then we explored a little further and we realized that this was systematic right across the whole business. So there was cumulatively thousands of dollars a day just being burned for these excess calls to S3. So their actual storage itself was there, and there was a nice flat line, so there was no red flag there. But the red flag was around these extra API calls all the time. So it was like they really build up, and in that instance, they just cached it, and so they slashed those costs. They were like 100 times cheaper just because they just cached the directory and they only just refreshed it whenever they actually felt like it was updated. So they just put some extra intelligence into their application, saved themselves a bag of cash, but those API calls can get really expensive, and that's across multiple services as well. It's not just, I've used S3 as the example here, but it's DynamoDB, etc. as well. All of these, there's a cost for those API calls, and that cost really adds up quickly. So it becomes a bit of a tax. So that's what I always tell people in the cloud, that networking costs can be a bit stealthy and can end up being a bit of a tax, but the just calling stuff and just using the services themselves, think about how much that you're doing, and is there something you can do in the client to buffer that?